So as usual, really good questions to start off with. Is there a correlation with levels of satisfaction in countries that have a low or high uncertainty avoidance culture? I did a little digging around to see if anyone researches, if they study the difference or the relationship between uncertainty avoidance and mental health. The results were not very consistent. They were kind of all over the place. There was a 2004 study that found that phobias, meaning clinically significant irrational fear, tended to be higher if the culture was high uncertainty avoidance and if there were very traditional gender roles, both of which are true in Japan. But then I found a study published within the past month or two, 2023, about 3 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. In high uncertainty avoidance cultures, people who sought out social support, who talked to other people when they felt afraid, they did a better job of managing anxiety. In low uncertainty avoidance cultures, seeking support from your friends and your family didn't help with anxiety as much. And then one study, I admit, I'm showing it to you just because I can't decide whether it's entertaining or fascinating. A team of researchers at Florida Atlantic University and Nova Southeastern University, they set out to find what particular measures of culture best predict terrorism. So they looked at individualism and collectivism. They looked at power distance, gender roles. And when they correlated terrorist acts with uncertainty avoidance, they found not a perfect one-to-one correlation, but a pretty strong one. And it was the strongest one they found. They said, out of all of the ways we categorize culture, the strongest predictor of terrorism was being a high uncertainty avoidance culture. Now, they only looked at terrorist incidents from the 1970s to the 1980s, chiefly because we've talked before about Kurt Hofstede. That's when he first collected his data. So it was fresh and it was the most accurate. But nothing else was as strong of a predictor. What that says about mental health, I'm not sure. So I don't have an easy answer, and the research kind of points multiple directions. What are the causes behind a culture becoming a low uncertainty avoidance culture and or vice versa? There are two major ones, and then there are other influences. The major cause is the history that the culture has with authority and with how people are governed. Italy is very high uncertainty avoidance. Back at the time of the Roman Empire, what the Roman Empire did differently, it was very much about the idea that the law applies to everybody. The laws are written out, and once they are written and approved, even the wealthy, even the powerful are subject to the law. In some of the lower uncertainty avoidance cultures, what was more common, you picked your ruler, you picked the wisest person you could, and then the ruler ruled as they saw fit. And there might not be written laws at all. So there was not agreement about what was right and what was wrong. But if you believed your ruler was wise, then what they told you to do is what people ought to do. Another big influence, and I should say of the second big influence, it tends to take very high uncertainty avoidance cultures and lower them a bit. That influence is how open is your community, your country, to immigration from outside. Now, Italy accepts a lot of immigration, and it's still high uncertainty avoidance. But many of the countries around the world, including Japan, that are fairly high uncertainty avoidance, they resist immigration from the outside. And you'll see the effects of high uncertainty avoidance more in remote rural towns in Japan. In Tokyo, you see a lot more of, we have people living here from all over the world, gaijin gonna gaijin, they do things differently and we are patient with them. Small towns, a little bit different. We will, in answering these questions, identify a couple more smaller influences, but the history with authority and governance and how much immigration you get are the major ones. Third question. Why most of Asian countries are high uncertainty avoidance, and also why most of Europe are low uncertainty avoidance. I may have given that idea. You might have come away from class thinking that was true. I don't think I out and out said that. It turns out it's not very true. In Europe, the countries along the Mediterranean Sea are very high uncertainty avoidance. Greece is very high, Portugal is very high, but Denmark, very low uncertainty avoidance. England, very low uncertainty avoidance. When it comes to Asia, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's see. There are several Asian countries that are lower. Hong Kong is low uncertainty avoidance. And last week, I gave you the case study of the Canadian business people and the Chinese business people, and I called China high uncertainty avoidance because the researcher who published the case study said so. That was me being sloppy. I went back and looked at Hofstede's data. China is a low uncertainty avoidance culture. As a matter of fact, the explanation that you pick a wise ruler and let the ruler rule by decision without laws that are written out, China is often given as the classic example of that in ancient times. Is the reason why there is difference on how high their uncertain avoidance between countries that believe in Christianity related to their denomination? Yes, absolutely yes. Kurt Hofstede said so explicitly. He said, what kind of Christianity makes a huge difference? Catholic countries, Italy, Portugal, several countries in South America, very high uncertainty avoidance. And the way the Catholic Church distributes its teachings, it writes a lot of things out. They have a document called the Catechism. It is written as questions and answers, and it's taught to children, and it teaches almost everything about any subject that could possibly come up. Now remember what we said about written out laws. Written out laws that you are expected to follow tend to produce high uncertainty avoidance. But now Denmark, England, the United States, predominantly the biggest Christian influence there are the Protestant, the non-Catholics who do not use the catechism. Last week I talked about freedom. You've been set free from the law. So the way Christianity is taught is study your Bible, grow in your relationship with God, and day to day make choices you think honor God's heart, but there are not explicit rules. Hofstede also found by his data that countries that are Hindu predominantly and predominantly Buddhist tend to be lower in uncertainty avoidance. And you might be thinking, wait, Japan is Buddhist. Japan is Buddhist, but Japan has its own unique history, the kind of influence Buddhism has on the culture. It's not necessarily that similar to India, to China, to some of the surrounding nations, especially the way Buddhism is braided up together with Shinto. So it doesn't function to make Japan low uncertainty avoidance the way it does some neighboring countries. Okay. Even though Japanese people don't believe in any religion like Italy and Germany, why is uncertainty avoidance so high in Japan? Kurt Hofstede admitted uncertainty avoidance can go up and down over time, and it tends to do with well-being and safety. Do the people in a community feel safe? Do they feel like their well-being is high? And that's economic, and that's other kinds of safety as well. So a nation that has a lot of natural disasters may be higher in uncertainty avoidance because of a lack of feeling of safety. And when it comes to economic well-being, the lost decades in Japan may actually sharpen or increase the degree of uncertainty avoidance. One other thing I put down to say here, this is another point where Christianity could be an influence. How is risk and safety meaningful? It is a Christian teaching, part of the Christian narrative, that the lack of safety is not especially scary, that it is to be expected. There's a saying, I hear it a lot, I've been using it lately. The safest place in the world is in the middle of God's will, because there is no safety anywhere else. I use that a lot because I come from and am returning to a land with a lot of mass shootings. And so what we say to each other is, God has already picked the last day of my life, and if today isn't it, I'm safe. And that makes people think about safety differently. All right. Are there any factors that affect the level of uncertainty avoidance other than religion? We've mentioned history with authority, immigration, experience and attitude about safety. But let me add, we think those are the influences, but it is a very hard question to answer. Most of the research into culture, it's descriptive, it does not explain. It says there are these differences in behavior, differences in knowledge from country to country, but answering why, it's very hard to answer and to prove your answer why. We started in this class with Henrich saying the individual collectivism split was because of the influence of the Catholic Church. And his argument is pretty good because of the evidence he can back it up with. How long has there been influence, and then how can you measure individualism and collectivism? But it's hard to measure this one. How would you measure any of the influences that I've described here and show that they led to high or low uncertainty avoidance. So a lot of the explanations, they're educated guesses, but they are guesses. Next question. Is there a process to make uncertainty avoidance higher or lower? Is it possible to change the degree of uncertainty avoidance? And my answer is probably not. Back in the 1980s, in the communication field, we study not just national culture, we study organizational culture, and we use a lot of the same methods and ideas. Back in the 1980s, there was a trend. There were lots of business consultants who would show you, if you were the CEO of a company, the president of a company, how you could change the culture of your company, and then your company would make a lot more money. We don't do that anymore because that idea is stupid. Because you don't walk in and change the culture. You're not in control of the culture. When you get that many people together, they will interact with each other. They will generate the culture. The wise leader in 2023, consulting people from business or communication, will try to understand the culture. They will try to work within the culture they've got to reach their company's goals. But the idea that you can change it? No, you can't change it. That's not how culture works. Another way I might put it, and there's nothing wrong with the question. I don't mean to say that that's a bad question. But you might think of it like, it would be like asking, can Japan do anything to get rid of earthquakes? No, you're stuck with them. But you can build your buildings so that they resist them. You can learn how to respond after earthquakes when people have been injured. You can do things to live alongside them. That's probably the limit of what you can do. All right. Why are there rules when Christianity embraces freedom and tries not to be legalistic? I've said for a very long time that if Christians were really mature and serious about our Christianity, we wouldn't have laws, we wouldn't have jails. Instead, what we would do is we would go out, we would spread the good news to everybody, we would meet as many needs as we could, and we would deal with things like violence and crime that way. And every time we don't do that, we are being immature and not committed about our faith. Let's see, how long do I have? I have about a minute and a half. I'm going to tell you my position on abortion, which is kind of an explosive topic in the United States. It's very common. Lots of public Christians believe what we need to do is outlaw all abortion. Here's my position. Every time an abortion happens, it is the ending of an innocent life. So every time it happens, it is heartbreaking. So what should we do about it? What we should do is we should make sure that no pregnant mother ever feels like an abortion is necessary because they have nowhere to turn. What should we do? We should make comprehensive sex education and birth control available so there are no accidental pregnancies. And other than that, we should live out our faith and do a lot of praying. But all the Christians who say, let's outlaw it, open your Bible and find me any support in your Bible for that. I'll give you a hint. There isn't any. So that is not something my interpretation of Christianity says that we ought to pursue. All right. It is 1:40. I know I have been doing 30 minutes instead of 20. I might come back to that last question at the end. But today, I have a whole lot to talk with you about on our new topic. When I first got the idea to teach this class, well, let me take one step back. I've said in some of the recent weeks, we would get to the topic relational mobility or marriages and romantic partnerships. And I would say, now the Christian influence here is an influence. I'm not saying it's the biggest one. This week, it's easy to explain. When I first thought this class up, I had two inspirations. The Henrich research on individualism and collectivism, and today's topic. If there is a difference in interpersonal communication between Westerners and people from collective cultures in Asia, this is the biggest one. It is very, very distinct. Now, let me first of all define the term. What did I do? Oh, there it is. For the purpose of me defining the term, let me create a hypothetical person that you are going to have a conflict with. This is Bob. You have a conflict with Bob if you and Bob both have a goal, and if Bob gets his goal, you don't get yours. And if you get your goal, Bob does not get his. Your goals are incompatible. Second, those incompatible goals must involve resources that are limited. It must involve something that is scarce, something that is finite. Third, one of you must be interfering with the other one. This is the social science definition of conflict. You have incompatible goals involving a scarce resource, and you're interfering with one another. I'll give you two examples. You and Bob might be roommates. Maybe what you want to do this evening is just go home, get into your bed, and just sleep the afternoon and the night away. Maybe Bob has been working hard, not having any fun, and what he wants to do in the home you share is bring his friends over, play some very loud music. He's been wanting to hear loud music. He's been wanting to have his friends over. He has a goal. You have a goal. If you get your goal, quiet and sleeping, he can't have his friends over and play music. If he has his party, you can't sleep. What's the scarce resource? You both live in the same house. There's no place you can rest as easily. He doesn't know where he can take his friends. Interference? He definitely interferes with you wanting to rest. You telling him to keep the music off so you can sleep interferes with his party. One other example. You might get married, and you and the person you married might have a child. And let's imagine your philosophy of raising the child. You want that child to be happy even if it limits how successful they are. And the person you marry, they might want that child to be successful even if it limits how happy they are. Now, those two goals are not compatible. The scarce resource is you both have limited authority with that one child. And every time one of you makes a decision that influences the happiness or the success of the child, the other one will probably see it as interference. One more thing to define it before we move on. It is not a conflict just because two people say harsh things to each other. Mean words are not conflict. They are their own problem. They're not good. But mean words do not create a conflict. It's not a conflict just because someone else is unhappy with you. Lots of things can make another person unhappy with you that are not conflict. It is also not a conflict just because you and someone else disagree. One more time, Hernandez Aguilar-san, which are better, cats or dogs? See, she's wrong about that, but it's okay. We have no conflict. She can have a cat, I can have a dog. There's no scarcity, and we're not interfering with each other. We didn't even express a goal. We just disagree. I do like cats, but dogs are better. Okay, let us move on from the definition. There are several different ways to describe how we respond to conflict. I am using one that a couple of researchers named Putnam and Wilson published in 1982. You can deal with conflict by dominating. You can use force, physical force or verbal force, to stop the other person. So if you want to rest and your roommate turns the music up, you could punch them, break their music equipment, and that would be dominating. It doesn't have to be physical. You could yell at them. You could threaten them. You could just say things that hurt their feelings until they wanted to leave. Whatever you did to make them stop having their party would be dominating. Then there is smoothing over. Smoothing over. That refers to all the ways to respond to conflict that try to preserve everybody's feelings and just make the problem go away. We sometimes talk about avoiding conflict. You might change what you do because you can imagine it might cause conflict in the future with someone in your life. So you change what you otherwise would do to avoid the conflict. If you do the same thing after the conflict begins, we call it accommodation. Accommodation, or simply giving in. So maybe your friend, your roommate comes home, turns the music on, sees you're there, and you say, I really need to get some rest, and they say, okay, and they leave. Now they resent you, they're angry, but they give in just to keep the peace. That would fall under smoothing over. The problem has not been taken care of, but they made the bad feelings temporarily go away. The third category of response to conflict we call problem solving. Problem solving. Sometimes this means compromise. You give up some of what you want, they give up some of what they want, and you both feel as though you were treated fairly. So, your roommate, Bob, might say, I am really excited and I brought my friends over. Could we just play 3 songs and have a dance party? 15 minutes. Then we'll leave and you can sleep. That might be a good compromise. You have to wait a little bit. They cut their party short. That would be problem solving. It's also problem solving when you do what we call collaboration. You talk to each other and you figure out a way to arrive at what we call a win-win solution. You don't think of the other person either as an enemy you have to fight or as someone you have to protect from bad feelings. Instead, the two of you talk directly and you think of a solution you both like. Let me tell you the teaching story I've probably told the most times in my career, the story of the orange. Let us imagine the fruit. You have one orange in your kitchen. You have to imagine the orange. And you see, as you walk into the kitchen wanting the orange, you see that your roommate has the orange in their hand. Now that's a scarce resource. There's only one. If you want it and they want it, you might have incompatible goals. And if they start to do something with it and you can't have it, they are interfering. But what if you talk to your roommate and you say, hey, what are you going to do with that orange? And they say, I was going to make some orange juice. And you might say, I'm about to bake a cake, and the recipe says to take orange peel and rub it and put the orange peel into the batter. Could I have the peel? And your roommate might say, sure, and take the whole peel off and hand it to you. And then you and your roommate would keep the entire pulp and make juice with it. Neither one of you had to compromise. You just had to talk to each other to understand the nature of the problem, and you come up with your own solution. Doing that also fits in the approach called problem solving. Now keep those in mind. There's one more factor to mention in talking about responses. There is whether you prevent conflict or whether you restore afterward. There are cultural associations, cultural tendencies to either put most of your thought into preventing conflict before it happens, or in other cultures, you don't think about conflict until it happens, but afterward you try to restore the relationship. The final factor that I have to introduce very briefly, the concept of face. Face we can define as the part of your identity that other people observe or experience when you interact. You have thoughts that nobody knows about. You have experiences when you're by yourself. None of those are your face. Other people, how they perceive you, that is your face. There are many ways we can divide up face. For our purpose, we just have to mention one right now. Self-face, other face. Self-face and other face. So, if everybody in here starts speaking up in the middle of class saying, you're wrong, that makes no sense, you're an idiot, I might think, oh no, my self-face is threatened. I think of myself as a capable teacher who knows my subject. So that might give me worries about my self-face. If, on the other hand, you're talking with a friend and you stop, you were about to tell a story or offer an opinion, and you think, if I do that, they might be uncomfortable, they might be embarrassed. That's other face. When you are protecting someone else from experiencing stress or a threat to their face, that's other face. So self-face, when you're worried about your own image and how you are viewed. Other face, when you are concerned about other people and how they will feel about the interaction. With all that in mind, last week, I briefly introduced you to Stella Ting Toomey. And I told you that she is the most influential scholar of intercultural communication in the communication field. We talked about her model of intercultural competence, content knowledge, cognitive flexibility, and mindfulness. But her major work, her most influential work, is a model of the difference in conflict behavior between people in the West and people in collective cultures in Asia. The name of her model is Face Negotiation. Face Negotiation. She says that if two Westerners deal with conflict, they'll probably figure it out. If two people from Asia, from a similar or the same culture, deal with conflict, they'll probably figure it out. Her model is about what happens when someone from a collective culture in Asia tries to work out a conflict with someone from the West. Here is what her how her model breaks it down. Now remember the three categories of responding to conflict: smoothing over, dominating, problem solving. She says we tend to choose, not 100% of the time, but we tend to choose based on what our face concern is. So people whose concern is other face are more likely to smooth over. They're more likely to respond to conflict in a way that temporarily makes it go away: avoidance or giving in. She further says that if your chief concern is self-face, you're more likely to dominate. So if I come in here and all of you start telling me I'm wrong and I'm crazy, I'm going to yell back. Maybe I'll take my water bottle and hit you. And in mentioning other face and self-face, I did leave one more possibility out. Problem solving as a response to conflict is predicted by mutual face. Mutual face. When you think of the conflict and you think, this damages my face, their face, and how we interact as a pair with an ongoing relationship. When that is your concern, when that is how you frame the conflict, people who think of it that way tend to either compromise or they will engage in the kind of collaboration to where they talk about what are you going to do with the orange, and they wind up with a solution that they both love. So she then went back to something we talked about in, I think, the third week of the class. The research from Hazel Marcus and Shinobu Kitayama on self-construal. She said people with an interdependent self-construal are most likely to be concerned with other face. Remember, you think you get your identity from the group. That's why other face is so important. They are most likely to engage in smoothing over. People who have an independent self-construal are more concerned with self-face. You define yourself from the things that are true of you as an individual, not how you fit into your relationships. Therefore, self-face is the most important, and in conflict, you are more likely to dominate. So what do you think you're going to see on that in problem solving? What kind of self-construal? We'll wait and see if we're going to be low uncertainty avoidance for a moment. I'll see if anyone wants to take a guess. Wrong guesses are perfectly okay. They're part of learning. Well, you only have two choices. Remember, self-construal? Yeah. But this is important. She says, here the relationship is so strong, you could almost say this is standard in collective cultures. And here, this is standard in individualist cultures. Here, she said, the relationship is not as strong. And concern with mutual face commonly comes up in individualist cultures, and they also engage in problem solving. But there is enough of a tendency in the direction of interdependent self-construal, predicting it, so you're not wrong, but you're a little wrong. Now you might be thinking, okay, it sounds like Japan wins. Because let me mention, I didn't mention it before, each of these responses to conflict is sometimes the most appropriate one. If someone breaks into your house in the middle of the night, You don't smooth over, and you don't compromise. You dominate them. If, on the other hand, you have a bad-tempered teenager that you are raising, sometimes even Americans will smooth over to give them time to work through whatever is hard for them that day. Each of these is sometimes appropriate, but this is the best one. Compromises and collaborations tend to produce conflict outcomes that are more sustainable. And it looks like, based on this, Japan wins. Japan has an edge over the West. It looks like that. But then I bring in Kenichi Obuchi. And Kenichi Obuchi is a very prolific researcher, and his work has focused on a couple of communication behaviors that are common in Japan. Stella Tingtoomey is Chinese American. The face negotiation model is about, it extends across Asia. Obuchi's work is specifically about behaviors characteristic in Japan. To begin with, assertiveness. Assertiveness is very uncommon. I've mentioned this a few times in the past. I am here. Fulbright brought me here because the Japanese government agrees with Obuchi and says assertiveness is very uncommon. His work, his data show that in organizations, Japanese people tend to want as their objective to be thought of as harmonious and likable and easy to get along with. And they will sacrifice immediate rewards because they think in the long term, if they have a reputation that they get along with everybody, then they will get raises, promotions, and other rewards. One other thing I'll mention, not really tied to face negotiation theory, but it is tied to conflict. Obuchi very recently has turned to researching forgiveness. Now we know what the word forgive means, but his new line of research, he said, I don't think anyone has really explored down in the details. Does forgiveness mean the same to a Japanese person as it does to someone in the United States? And in 2019, he published a study that explored exactly that question. And he found there were several differences. The one I'm going to highlight is that for Japanese people, he said, forgiveness is primarily a decision and it is about behavior. I decide to forgive, my behavior will be governed by the fact that I forgave someone. In the United States, forgiveness is primarily emotional. I'm going to take my negative emotions toward the person that I had the conflict with. I'm going to release and get rid of those negative emotions so I don't have them anymore. And in Japan, emotional transformation is not an important part of forgiveness, or at least that's what his data showed. All right. That brings us then to what this class is about, the influences on the difference. So we've isolated two differences. There is a little bit of an edge. People with interdependent self-construal are more likely to engage in problem solving, but people in Japan are very unlikely to practice assertiveness. And I just realized I probably should define for you what assertiveness is. Let me do that now. Assertiveness is the middle ground between being passive and being aggressive. Another way to put it, it's the middle ground between smoothing over and dominating. Smoothing over is concern for the other person. I don't want them to be upset. Dominating is concern for yourself. I want what I think I need. Assertiveness combines both. I want what I need. I will therefore bring it up and talk about it directly. But I am concerned for and care about the other person. I will therefore do it positively, cheerfully, in a way that is careful to show them that I care about the relationship. So let me think. Who have I not harassed today? Kubota-san, would you be willing to do something that would drive any sensei crazy? Just sit there and do that for a couple of seconds. It's a demonstration for the class. Just tap on your desk. Just tap. Make noise. Yeah, and keep doing it. Keep doing it. Okay. Gonna ignore it. Gonna ignore it. They'll stop eventually. That's me smoothing over. Okay, keep doing it. Would you stop that? That's dominating. Okay, keep doing it. Kubota-san, you are one of my favorite people in here, and I love the fact that you have all that energy. I think this may be distracting everybody else. So after class, come and talk with me about whatever you're thinking about. You can tap as much as you want, just not right now, okay? That was assertive. I directly bring it up to him. I do my best to show I care about you, I like you, I'm not angry at you, but I am being direct. And it is a basic ingredient of problem solving, of being collaborative. You cannot compromise, you cannot collaborate if you won't talk directly about the problem. If your pattern is to avoid, if your pattern is to give in instantly, then you're not going to respond to conflicts with problem solving. So assertiveness is kind of the secret ingredient that comes with great difficulty for people from Japan. That's why I want to bring this down to several passages that I want to play for you. And once again, I have not sound checked. We will hope that the equipment is all in good working order. Each of these is Jesus talking. Today is not for anything from his disciples. So if you are standing before the altar and you are prepared to make your sacrifice to God, and while you're there, you realize there is a conflict between you and someone else, leave your offering right there, go take care of the conflict. In other words, don't avoid. Don't give in. Go talk to them directly about it. That's the first. Here is the second. Boom, boom, boom. This is Jesus teaching directly, this is what you do when you have a conflict. So, go to them, confront them, take a brother with you, bring it before the church. None of those are consistent with smoothing over. I do not want to give you the impression I'm saying that Americans follow Jesus' teachings on conflict and Japanese people don't. That's not my point. Because elsewhere, Jesus said, don't dominate, don't threaten, don't fight. He said all those things, and those are very common in the United States. My one and only point is assertiveness is practiced a lot more readily in the United States, and assertiveness, I would make the argument, its root in the culture has a lot to do with Christian teaching. Often, I teach at a Christian university, and when I talk about assertiveness to my students, let me go ahead and play for you Jesus teaching what the single most important command in the entire Bible is. And then I will point out he's teaching about assertiveness. Okay.
先生、立法の中でどの戒めが一番重要ですか？イエスは彼に言われた。あなたは心を尽くし、命を尽くし、知性を尽くして、あなたの神、主を愛しなさい。これが重要な第一の戒めです。あなたの隣人を自分自身のように愛しなさい。という第二の戒めもそれと同じように重要です。この二つの戒めに律法と預言者の全体がかかっているのです。
So love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's the first commandment. Weeks ago we talked about worship. And love your neighbor as you love yourself. And when I introduce assertiveness, do you remember the difference between assertiveness and aggression or passivity? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love yourself enough to speak up. Love your neighbor enough that when you do it lovingly. Over the weekend, there was a Christian pastor by the name of Tim Keller. He had been battling cancer for a long time. His battle ended. He taught a particular episode in Jesus' life that is very famous. And when he taught it, I understood that it was a lesson in assertiveness. So I'm going to give it to you right now. A woman was brought to Jesus. She had been caught in the act of adultery. This is what happened. Stop that. What? Stop. Bring it back later. So, at the end of that encounter, Jesus said, "Has no one condemned you?" And she said, "No one, Lord." And what he said, "Then I don't condemn you either, but go and leave this life of sin." She had been caught cheating on her husband. Now, how is that an example of assertiveness? Well, the smoothing over response would have been, "Nobody else condemns you? Then I don't condemn you either. You must not have done anything wrong." The dominating response would have been, "No one condemns you? Well, I condemn you. You're a whore." What was the assertive response? "I'm not going to condemn you, but you did sin. Stop it." So he raised the issue, and he told her, this is the problem. But he had just saved her life. He did it lovingly with respect for her. There's an argument to be made, I will make it very, very briefly, that assertiveness, it is part of the essence of Christianity down at its core. People who don't have a religious faith, they dismiss the idea that there is a God. They sometimes do it with a lot of mocking, which in some sense is dominating. People who follow other major world religions, very commonly, they think there is a God, but they think God is angry, God punishes and must be placated. And so what they do is they smooth over. But what Christianity teaches is God invites us into a relationship that is a family relationship of unconditional love, and within that, he confronts us about our disobedience and wrongdoing, which would mean the essence of Christianity is God's assertiveness. All right. So now, the final thing to say about, to go back to our presentation, I have realized that once again, I didn't let you get into your trios because I was so excited to get started talking about conflict. But I do want to talk about forgiveness. The Obuchi 2019 study said, I'll mention briefly again, forgiveness is a decision and it's a pattern of behavior. Now, in the United States, that's called hollow forgiveness. It is regarded as dishonest, inauthentic, and if you haven't genuinely forgiven, if you haven't transformed your feelings, then there's something missing. Now, those things are culturally determined, and it's very complicated to understand how emotions work in different cultures. When we talked about self-construal, we talked about how emotions operate differently. Where your self-construal is independent, your emotions are inside yourself. Where your self-construal is interdependent, you experience closeness to or distance from other people, and emotions that are not helpful, you can simply choose not to feel. So where does this difference come from? It's probably complicated, but let me show you an influence that once again comes straight out of Jesus' teaching. This is Jesus' most sustained teaching on forgiveness. And it's here. Bump, bump. Jesus is going to teach an entire parable. The important part comes at the end. A parable is a teaching story that he made up.
その時、ペテロが妹に来て言った。主よ、兄弟が私に対して罪を犯した場合、何回許すべきでしょうか ?7 回まででしょうかイエスは言われた。私は7回までとは言いません。7回を70倍するまでです。ですから、天の御国は王である一人の人に例えることができます。 その人は自分の家来たちと生産をしたいと思った。生産が始まると、まず1万タラントの負債のある者が王のところに連れてこられた。彼は返済することができなかったので、その主君は彼に自分自身も妻子も持っているものも全て売って返済するように命じた。それで家来はひれ伏して主君を拝し、もう少し待ってください。そうすれば全てを開始します。と言った。家来の主君はかわいそうに思って彼を許し、負債を免除してやった。ところが、その家来が出ていくと、自分に100デナリの借りがある仲間の一人に出会った。彼はその人を捕まえて首を絞め、借金を返せと言った。彼の仲間はひれ伏して、もう少し待ってください。そうすればお返しします。と嘆願した。しかし彼は承知せず、その人を引いていって、負債を返すまで牢に放り込んだ。彼の仲間たちは、事の成り行きを見て非常に心を痛め、言って一部始終を主君に話した。そこで主君は彼を呼びつけて言った。悪い家来だ。お前が私に懇願したから、私はお前の負債をすべて免除してやったんだ。私がお前を憐れんでやったように、お前も自分の仲間を憐れんでやるべきではなかったのだ。こうして主君は怒って負債をすべて返すまで彼を極意たちに引き渡した。あなた方もそれぞれ自分の兄弟を心から許さないなら、私の天の父もあなた方にこのようになさるのです。
So, I mentioned the pastor whose name was Tim Keller, who lost his battle with cancer and died over the weekend. That parable used to bother me. Not 5 minutes ago, I said that God invites us into a relationship of unconditional love, and that's different from being afraid God's going to punish you. And then there's Jesus telling a story of a ruler saying, lock them up in prison and torture them. And Jesus then says, that's what my Father will do to you if you don't forgive from the heart. Now, first of all, what Jesus says he expects is forgiveness from the heart. Forgiveness that is transformation of emotions. But secondly, I've said bunches of times, like I explained the difference between Christianity and the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witness by saying whether God accepts you or not is not dependent on what you do. And then here's Jesus saying, unless you forgive people, God will lock you up and torture you. But you have to understand what the teaching was there. This is something years ago I heard Pastor Timothy Keller explain, and he explained it this way. The way the gospel is supposed to work is when you realize you were forgiven and that the gift is free. Then the response, ideally the response will be one of gratitude and of realizing the scale of what you were given. It has to begin with you understanding that you have been disobedient and that you do have a lot of wickedness in you. At that point, if you refuse to forgive other people, then you don't understand how you were forgiven. You not forgiving other people is the proof that what that forgiveness should have done to you never happened. And the reference in that parable to the unforgiving servant being locked in prison, what that means is people who do not understand what they were offered and what the forgiveness means, they imprison themselves. And their refusal to forgive other people imprisons them. I very briefly want to describe to you something I teach in the United States as a method of forgiving from the heart. Gracious attribution. Now, attribution is a social science term. When we see other people's behavior, we don't know what thought or what attitude caused it. If you see someone walk into class a few minutes late, which today several people did, you might attribute it to, oh, they're disorganized. Oh, they don't plan ahead. Those are attributions. Or you might say, they have busy lives. There might have been a club meeting or an organization meeting that got out late. Those are attributions. So the method of gracious attribution, when you don't know why someone behaved a certain way, especially if it makes a problem for you, think of all the possible explanations. So, I don't know how many of you drive frequently, but you might be out driving and some bad driver might cut you off. And you have to slam on your brakes and it's really scary. And you get mad at them. Well, what are the possible explanations? They could have been playing on their phone. Maybe they're really young, just got their driver's license, and they're really immature. Maybe they're just a bad driver and they shouldn't even have a license. Maybe they just got bad news that their family member is in the hospital and they're rushing to their side. Maybe they just had a bad day like you have a lot of the time and they have a lot on their mind. Which of those explanations, and when I teach it in the United States, we fill the board with explanations and we pick, which is the easiest one to forgive? They almost always say, family member in the hospital. If you don't know why they cut you off, pick the explanation that's easy to forgive. Tell yourself, they might have a family member in the hospital. They're rushing to be near, and then let go. It's what their faith teaches them they should do, and it also feels better. So, gracious attribution. That's a method you might try. Along with it, I tell the story of Beulah May Donald. Beulah May Donald was born and grew up near New Orleans in Louisiana, which is where they have Mardi Gras. Right down near Texas, not that far from where I grew up. She was very poor. She is maybe 30, 40 years older than I am. She's no longer alive. She was very poor. She did not finish high school. I believe she dropped out of school when she was 13. She got married. She raised 6 children. One of them graduated law school. 5 of them went to college. Her youngest was named Michael. And when he was, from memory, 19, one night, a group of men who were white supremacists and who hated black people, they grabbed him off the street. They beat him until he was unconscious, and then they killed him. And then they took him, his dead body, and they hung it in the tree across the street from her house. She knew her son had not come home. She walked out her front door the next morning, and there he was hanging. The police had to work for a number of years before they could arrest anybody. And the first person they arrested, the evidence against him was so good that they said, we will get the death penalty for you unless you turn in everybody who was with you and testify against them. So he agreed to. And at his trial, the day that he was to be sentenced, he already knew he was going to be sentenced to life imprisonment, no parole. They asked, is there anything you would like to say before we pass sentence? And he turned around, and there was Beulah May Donald. She had come to court every day of every trial. And he burst out crying. He burst into tears. He said, I know I deserve to go to jail forever. I wish I could take back what I did to your son, and I know I don't deserve to be forgiven. And she interrupted him. And she said, son, I forgave you the morning we found Michael. That morning I prayed to Jesus. I asked him to take care of you, and he will. My hero is not LeBron James. My hero is not Harry Styles. I want to be like Beulah May